welcome to the show.
Boomer, thanks for having me on, man. I can't wait for this.
This is a conversation. You and I have had multiple conversations. We have multiple, it seems like a fractal like connection in terms of networks. But this is a conversation I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time. And I'm glad that you're joining me here today to talk about a topic that needs some addressing for sure.
Yeah, psychedelics, in particular, microdosing is one of those things that sort of entered our cultural zeitgeist the last few years. And there are a lot of people who still, have questions. There's a lot of unknowns in that process because there just hasn't been a lot of education about it, in the past.
How did you come to this field? Because originally, remind me again where you're from. Are you from California originally?
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
That's not quite California. So
Midwest.
yeah,
I'm a
Midwest
Midwest
boy,
guy.
which I'm a Midwest boy too.
Uh-huh.
And so Midwest boy, California, psychedelics, connect the dots for me. How did it eventually click for you?
Yeah, so, grew up in West Michigan, which is more traditional, Midwest, salt of the earth type family,
Hmm.
suburb. Smoked cannabis when I was 16 for the first time as sort of my initial act of rebellion. And then when I was 19, started to look into psychedelics and did psilocybin mushrooms. And soon after this is at all high doses,
Hmm.
high doses of LSD with close friends in beautiful outdoor naturey settings. And, I've always been a bit of a rebel, a bit of an outsider, a very independent thinker, kind of like carving my own path, if you will. And one of the conclusions, I would say the main conclusion that I came to from those high dose experiences was coming to terms with death, which sounds very, odd, but this is what happens is we have this ego dissolution. We realize that death is just another step in the process of our own, evolution. And that for that reason, why not live to the greatest extent possible? And
Hmm.
so when I graduated from college at the age of 21, I moved to Turkey where I taught English.
Is Istanbul or somewhere else?
I was in Istanbul initially for about 2 months. I taught at a camp, a summer camp. I taught
Hmm.
Turkish kids how to teach English and how to play sports. So basically playing sports with them through teaching English.
Hmm.
And did that, worked at a private school in a place called Izmir for about 9 months. And in my free time, just taught myself how to build an online business. And then once I left that job, I took that skill, teaching English, and I built my first coaching business online where I taught one-on-one and group classes for people, professionals from Japan or China, or even immigrants who had already come to the United States so they could go get their MBA at Harvard, so they could go become pharmacists. I essentially trained them on psychology, like really high performance psychology for passing this test. And one thing led to another. That business is going pretty well. In 2015, I noticed a few trends going. One trend that I noticed was cannabis was becoming legal. In 2015, there were about 4 states that had already legalized cannabis. There were several more states that had medicalized cannabis. So clearly there was something going on there. There was more and more research on psychedelics coming out of places like Johns Hopkins and NYU. And so I was like, there's something going on there. And then Tim Ferriss, who is really, kind of a cultural star, if you will, started publishing public podcasts about psychedelics,
Hmm.
which I thought, oh, this is interesting. So in mid 2015, I started a website called The Third Wave, which was essentially an educational resource with a particular focus on microdosing that just help to inform and educate people about responsible and intentional psychedelic use. And
Hmm.
that was sort of, it was initially a hobby project. I was running this coaching business as my main business. The Third Wave was a hobby project for a couple of years. And in 2017, turned it into a lifestyle business. And then recently, we've started to raise investment and make it a real legit business as more and more money is poured into the psychedelic space. So I kind of have this interesting intersection of travel. I've traveled to about 60 countries, lived in 5 different countries, building online educational businesses, which is what happened with the third wave. And then I also had a brief hiatus, if you will, in 2018, because in 2018, I was fortunate enough to speak at a number of tech and business conferences, the Next Web in Amsterdam, South by Southwest conference in Germany, another conference in Switzerland, which was like a one-day self-optimization conference. And just noticed that a lot of people who were going to these conferences, these tech and business conferences, they were interested in psychedelics, but they didn't want to maybe, there were a lot of concerns because it was so new. There's a lot of unknowns. So for that reason, we launched a legal psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands called Synthesis, with a co-founder of mine who is Dutch, and started doing retreats just outside of Amsterdam with psilocybin truffles, which are legal in the Netherlands. And so I've started a few businesses. There was an educational component to that, and now it's really like I would say what drives me most is an awareness of the crises that we seem to be going through as a culture. We have the mental health crisis, we have an income inequality crisis, we have a meaning crisis, basically an existential crisis. And what the climate crisis is also a big one. And I think, what really motivated me about educating people about the benefits of responsible psychedelic use is these are tools that help us to wake up to these crises and understand them and feel them. And in that feeling, we then actually can start to take action on what do we need to do to address them and overcome them. And that, I would say, is sort of my main mission, is how can psychedelics, when used responsibly, help with humanity kind of getting through its current period of crisis.
And I want to go into a number of those benefits that you've laid out, because I think meaning, ego dissolution, all of that existential crisis, I've dealt with in a way through psychedelics, at least effectively. Before I go into kind of the science side of things, which is what I love about the third wave, you've lived outside the US and you said 5 different countries. What's your favorite one? If you had to, I guess first off, what are the 5? And then we can kind of do from there.
Yeah, so I lived in Turkey for a year,
Yeah.
and I know Turkey the best, I would say, because I lived there for a year. I taught at a Turkish school. I was close with like a Turkish family. I learned, Turkish, at least some Turkish. So in terms of the culture that I know best, it would be Turkey. There are a lot of beautiful parts of it. There are also a lot of things that I didn't like about it, but it was fantastic. I also lived in Thailand, in Chiang Mai. But when I was living in Thailand, it was much more of like, I was a digital nomad. I was hanging out with other expats who were living in Chiang Mai in Thailand.
It's a very, very common place to do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I loved the food and I loved everything about it, but I wouldn't say I was as like integrated into Thailand. And then I lived in Portugal, in Lisbon, and Lisbon was probably my favorite, overall, because it has the best weather in Western Europe.
Yeah.
It's on the water. All drugs are decriminalized in Lisbon and Portugal. So there's just a sense of freedom there that you don't have elsewhere. The people are very kind and warm and friendly. And the city, Lisbon itself, is going through an amazing rebirth, which makes it very affordable.
Yeah.
For people. So lived there, lived in Mexico as well, in Oaxaca. And again, food. This is what draws me. It's food. Food in Mexico, the food in Thailand. It's like that.
Food in Portugal, right?
In Portugal as well. And then I lived in Hungary, in Budapest, for a short period of time as well. So those are the 5 foreign countries that I lived in, and I would say of those, Lisbon, Portugal was my favorite, and Turkey is the one that I know the best.
Amazing. I can second Lisbon. I haven't been to Turkey, ironically. I've done the 60 countries thing, but I haven't been to Turkey. It's on the list. Let's go into the third wave, because I came across your site because I was looking for somebody to explain the science behind all this stuff. And I know the research goes back quite a bit, but you aggregated it in such a nice way. Can we talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics, specifically from the scientific research side? Like when did it get started, and what do we actually know?
So when it comes to the history of psychedelics, this is sort of where even the name, the third wave, came from.
Mm-hmm.
right? Where there's a first wave, there's a second wave, and there's a third wave. And the first wave was, in indigenous use for thousands of years. These medicines have been used since, ancient times. So that was like, there's obviously a rich there's a rich evolutionary history. And what most people don't realize is people like Plato and Aristotle back in ancient Greece, they were utilizing psychedelics for insight and awareness about the nature of reality,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is fascinating. So obviously we didn't have the scientific objective methods that we do now to measure that, but if you read through Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy, they will refer to these experiences at the Eleusinian mysteries, which is
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. So then when it comes to the second wave of psychedelics, this is really, if the first wave was ancient Greece and kind of the introduction of plant medicine into Western culture, because that was the bedrock of Western culture, then the
Mm-hmm.
second wave of psychedelics was the reintroduction of psychedelics into Western culture. And that was the counterculture. That was the 50s and 60s. And how
Mm-hmm.
most people know the 50s and 60s is Timothy Leary and, like dropping out and sort of like kind of, doing that whole crazy thing. But what most people don't realize is there were over 1,000 clinical papers published on psychedelics in the 50s and 60s. And it was a highly respected and regarded sort of nascent area of research that held so much potential. But unfortunately, because specifically with LSD, it got out of control, there was a huge government backlash and crackdown on psychedelics, which led to this sort of dark age period where they
Was it Nixon or was it somebody else that kind of put the clamp down? I'm just trying to remember who it would
so
have been.
it was like a cascading effect, right? So
Mm-hmm.
California was really the epicenter for a lot
Yeah.
of it, the Summer of Love in 1966. And so initially the state of California made it illegal in 1966. And then Richard Nixon came in a couple years later with his war on drugs in 1968 and cracked down on it federally.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1971, the UN passed a convention, an act, the UN Convention Act, that basically made all psychedelics illegal globally. And
Mm-hmm.
that if anyone was to have them legal in their country, that they would be kicked out of the UN. So, and that was, of course, informed by the United States because, the United States has been, especially since World War II, the predominant world power. So anything, they want to see happen
Mm-hmm.
has happened. So that and a lot of the research was fascinating. It showed that LSD was super effective for depression, for autism, for alcoholism was a big one. Big
Mm-hmm.
for alcoholism and addiction. And so, we basically entered this dark period. And then in 1996, there was a guy named Bob Jesse who started talking with Roland Griffiths. And Roland Griffiths was a highly respected addiction researcher,
He's
researched
your
nicotine.
University of Minnesota, right? Or I could have that
Ro-
wrong.
Roland is at Johns Hopkins.
That's right. Okay.
So,
There's
so
somebody in there that's a Minnesota guy, but
Dennis McKenna.
okay. There you go.
Dennis McKenna, yeah. So Roland, basically like they started doing research in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then there was the first landmark paper published on psychedelics in 2006, which essentially proved that psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, when used within, the right container, can facilitate a mystical experience. And that happens, it's effective. It shows that if you do it this way, that 70 to 80% of people will have a mystical experience. And as a result of having a mystical experience, there are significant physiological benefits and psychological benefits,
Mm-hmm.
including, just more contentment, a release of, a healing of depressive symptoms, a sense of this being the most profound experience that one has ever, gone through. There were all these things that they were starting to build a framework for. And then since 2006, there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of papers published proving the efficacy of psychedelics for treating everything from PTSD to addiction, to alcoholism, to end of life anxiety, to treatment resistant depression, to major depressive disorder. Like basically if you pick OCD, if you pick a clinical condition that you struggle with, psychedelics likely help with it, which I think is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And right now we kind of sit at this interesting area where, psilocybin, I believe, is legal in Colorado, right?
Decriminalized in
Decriminalize,
Denver.
okay. Decriminalize in Denver. We sit at this interesting kind of precipice, if you will, whereby MAPS is going through phase 3 FDA trials on MDMA, I believe, for PTSD. And, the future seems quite bright for psychedelic and psychedelic therapy. I mean, ketamine for depression is already being used. Um, when we look at it in terms of just let's go down the microdosing route, because when I started investigating microdosing, actually, like, I was microdosed by a friend, dissolution of ego, loved it. And when we went down, so microdosing for performance, when did this start to become a part of the picture? And because I know you were one of the first people publishing on it and how to do it, when did it start becoming part of the picture? And maybe we can start getting into tactically how people can use it and what the benefits are.
Yeah. So what's fascinating is sort of again, I studied history in college. So
Yeah.
I'm a history buff. I'm a history
You,
nerd.
you and me
Like,
both, man.
yeah. Right. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like all these. So I think context is so important and so useful to explain,
Yeah.
current trends that are going on. So, most people at this point have heard the Steve Jobs quote, that Walter Isaacson wrote in his biography. And Steve Jobs essentially said that, like, doing LSD was one of the most profound things that he ever did. Top 2 or 3 profound things he ever did, that it basically helped him to see things from a totally different perspective, and that he was totally different ever since that point. And so there's a rich history because a lot of the initial psychedelic research was in Menlo Park, which is in Silicon Valley. Then the tech world and the psychedelic world, the use of psychedelics in the 50s and 60s is sort of what inspired, the tech boom in the 70s, 80s, and onwards, the whole computer revolution. So I think that's the first key point to look at. It's like engineers and scientists and developers and whatnot, we've been using LSD for 50 years to help with creativity and performance and leadership. It's just been under the covers, right?
Yeah,
It's been
of
kind
course.
of a trade secret of what's going on in Silicon Valley. And then, in 2012, Jim Fadiman published a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And Jim was one of the researchers from the 60s who, he basically did the only research study proving that LSD helps with creativity. So he took in a number of engineers in 1966, about 25, put them through a study where they took about 100 micrograms of LSD, and he had them come in with a big problem that they wanted to solve, that they were struggling with. And essentially he published this entire paper proving that, look, LSD helped with coming up with all these innovative solutions. And this is back in 1966. And then while he was in the middle of doing that study, he gets a letter from the federal government saying, hey, LSD is illegal, immediately sees everything that you're doing. And he tells a story of, like, he gets the letter and he had just dosed everyone. He's like, I got this letter tomorrow, and continued with the experience. And then after that point, LSD was illegal and couldn't be used. So that was sort of like,
So, Paul, just real quick, for perspective on people, 100 micrograms of LSD versus, what are we talking about in terms of micro versus larger dose here?
So a moderate dose is 100 micrograms. A microdose is about 10 micrograms.
Okay, perfect.
Approximately, so a microdose is about a tenth of a regular dose.
Got it.
Is what we're looking at. So you have that rich history, and then, Jim published his book in 2012, had a single chapter on microdosing, and then Jim was on the Tim Ferriss podcast in 2015 and spoke about microdosing. And then that's when we started to see this really come out. There was a piece published in Rolling Stone, a piece published elsewhere. They were like, oh, Silicon Valley engineers and recent scientists are like microdosing for performance and creativity. And ever since then, it sort of like blew up. And 2015 was when I first heard about it. And because I had had these high dose experiences before that were really profound, for a week or two after I did high doses, it was always like things felt easy in my life. I was disciplined. I would go to the gym consistently. I would eat much healthier. I would treat people around me with much more compassion and interest and openness. And then eventually, after 1 or 2 weeks, some of those things would dissipate. So I was like, I wonder if I microdose, it's a way to continue to integrate and just maintain that level of presence with everything and mindfulness with everything. So I think, what's really going on at the fundamental level with microdosing is just like meditation, just like breath work, just like yoga. It's just helping us to be more present. It's helping the hemispheres in our brain to, the two hemispheres to communicate in a better way. It's helping us to generally just be more healthy and well. And then when we're more present as high performers, then it becomes easier to be creative, right? Because we're not sort of in this anxious sympathetic state, but we can actually drop back and relax into a parasympathetic state and respond to things and be creative from that position. And then with creativity comes flow and productivity and all these other sort of things that people will often read about with microdosing. But at the fundamental level, it's presence, it's mindfulness. And then it's just sort of the benefits build on top of that.
So the presence in mindfulness, and my understanding is a lot of this comes from shutting down of the default mode network, or at least sort of working through the ego. But why don't we go a little bit into like just tactically, if somebody wanted to start microdosing, what does that actually look like? Because for instance, right now, I mean, between us and whoever's listening to this, I microdosed on psilocybin mushrooms, right? And so, I'm enjoying that, but tactically, how would people start to get into this, or how would they explore this space if you were to recommend a way?
So one are the risks. So I think
Yeah,
just
of course. Yeah, let's lay out the risks and just
addressing those
like
up front,
fully disclose everything, right?
Will be good, and then I can just give all the information there. So the main risk is that these substances are still illegal in most places,
Of
right?
course.
So the Netherlands is an exception because there's psilocybin truffles, but generally like LSD and mushrooms are illegal. So just so people have that framework. The other risk to be aware of is specifically with LSD, and we can talk a little bit more about this, the difference between LSD and mushrooms, because that's often a big question as well. But with LSD is more dopaminergic. So there's more dopamine going on. And that's why it can be useful very useful for flow states and productivity, just like caffeine and coffee. But if someone already struggles with anxiety, or they have insomnia, or they generally tend to be a pretty high strung person, LSD might just make that work. So I think that's also something to be mindful of.
So
with that,
go ahead, Paul. I interrupted you.
Well, with that being said, and then we can kind of dive deeper. The basic logistics of getting started with microdosing are to start low and go slow, is what I like to say. So with LSD, a typical microdose is 10 micrograms. And the best place to start is probably start at 5 micrograms, then 7.5 micrograms, then 10 micrograms, then 12.5 micrograms, then 15 micrograms. And of course, what we're doing through this process is we're titrating. We're titrating our dose level to understand, particularly both from a data-driven perspective, maybe through, blood tests, through the Aura ring, through other methodologies that we can use through data, how useful it is, but also just an intuitive sense. Like, does this feel right? Is this giving me the energy I want? Am I a little too anxious? Just like starting to develop that relationship with it to understand how it impacts us. So I think that's always the best way to start. With mushrooms, it would be something closer to probably 0.05 grams, so 50 milligrams of psilocybin, 100 milligrams of psilocybin, 150 milligrams of psilocybin. And usually what I will do when I'm microdosing psilocybin is I'll combine it with lion's mane and niacin. This is called the Paul Stamets stack. Because lion's mane and niacin are both lion's mane is also neuroprotective and helps with neurogenesis, just like psilocybin does. And so that's a useful stack. I've also microdosed psilocybin mushrooms with ashwagandha because it's an adaptogen. It just helps with maintaining a sense of balance throughout the day. So I think those are probably the best things to be aware of when it comes to starting with microdosing.
So I guess maybe I should have done this earlier, but laying out the cast of characters when it comes to microdosing. We have LSD and psilocybin predominantly. Are there other ones that you also consider worth exploring in the world of microdosing?
So I think two substances to be very mindful of, specifically because they can be easier to purchase, are 1P LSD, which is a very close cousin to LSD, and that can be purchased through like the clear web. You need Bitcoin, but you can purchase it through the clear web through Canada. And then there's another substance called 4-ACO-DMT, which is a psilocybin analog. And same sort of situation. It's very similar to psilocybin, but you can purchase it from Canada. So I would say those are two things to be mindful of. The other thing that people should be mindful of is mescaline.
Yeah.
Mescaline is from the cacti. It's the psychoactive component in cacti, both San Pedro and peyote. And I think one of the fascinating elements of psychedelics, both with high doses and microdoses, is its anti-inflammatory properties. And we know that inflammation is more or less the key thing that's tied to longevity. So if you can keep inflammation reduced, as this is why omega-3s are so important. This is why, minimizing vegetable oil intake is so important. This is why, getting tons of sunshine is so important. So microdosing is just another way. And mescaline is the most anti-inflammatory of all the psychedelics. And so that's also something to be mindful of with microdosing is it's probably, if you can find it, mescaline is the ideal way to microdose.
Okay. And I guess in terms of ranking priorities, or maybe going through those cast of characters and saying what are sort of the chief benefits. Like you mentioned mescaline as being the anti-inflammatory. LSD, I've looked at as more of a dissolution of ego. Are there additional things that, for instance, LSD, psilocybin have their own properties, additional benefits for each of those that you wouldn't mind highlighting?
For psilocybin and LSD in particular?
Yeah, psilocybin and LSD. We can go into the other ones as well.
So benefits, I would say, again, all of them, they just help with cultivating more presence. I think LSD is more useful for flow states, for hiking, like going outside and like having a lot of energy. If you want to go for a long hike or a walk, LSD is really good for that. For jujitsu or any sort of physical exercise, LSD will be really, really good for that. Potentially for like, if there's any sort of intense endurance sports, LSD would be really, really good for that as well. Cross-country skiing or even snowboarding, or again, you need to know your substance before you start doing it. But like if you titrate it appropriately and you understand how it's going to affect you, I think LSD is best for that. Psilocybin is more best for like emotional processing and the development of intuition, because psilocybin is more serotonergic. It's tied to contentment and ease and peace. So, when I would microdose with psilocybin, I would often do it in conjunction with therapy. From a therapeutic perspective, it just helps with talking about emotions. It helps with opening up emotions and dealing with emotions. So I find that's usually the frame of reference that I use. Now, I will say, and I think this is really good for me to share with the audience, is when I first started microdosing in 2015, I microdosed with LSD for 7 months. I did it twice a week, and that's something important to emphasize with microdosing. It's usually done once or twice a week for a period of anywhere from 30 to 60 days, tracking and measuring from day 1 to day 30 or 60 the impacts that it has on your overall baseline, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And when I first started microdosing, it was with 7 months. It was for 7 months. It was twice a week. It was anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 micrograms. I would sort of experiment and play around with the different levels, and it was very useful. But when I moved to New York soon after that, I had to stop microdosing with LSD. I could only microdose with psilocybin from time to time because the energy was too intense in New York. And in fact, nowadays, like where I'm at currently, I've cut out all coffee. I don't drink coffee anymore because it is so stimulating. And I also don't really microdose LSD anymore. The only thing that I'm microdosing nowadays is psilocybin mushrooms, particularly because I noticed that LSD was leading me to be in a more anxious state, a more like really driven state, and I just needed time to like chill out. And psilocybin mushrooms with these other like plant medicines, whether it's lion's mane or ashwagandha or cacao or whatever, ginseng or you name it, there are going to be a ton of botanical formulations that start to come out.
Can we go,
it just felt like
I want to go deep on the cacao because I've played around with this one. What was your experience with psilocybin plus cacao? That was
Well, cacao is really known as like a more of a heart opener, right? It's an empathogen, if you will. And I've done cacao ceremonies in the past where it's not, I mean, it has a little bit of psychoactivity, but it's not obviously like super psychoactive. And I just noticed that it just helped more with sort of the heart opening, the sensitivity, the compassion, so sort of those elements. Whereas when I microdose psilocybin with lion's mane and niacin, it's a bit more on the cognitive, part.
Could we talk about the importance of set and setting with not just microdosing, but we'll probably transition back into larger doses here. When you're doing this, I mean, obviously you can use it in a work setting to a certain extent, you know, legal disclosures aside. But when you're doing this, what kind of setting do you have? You mentioned earlier psilocybin in therapy, but also are you using these in meditative states? Are you using these predominantly as a work catalyst? How are you using them?
Yeah. So what's the intention going in to this? And,
Mhm.
and intention is so important because, psychedelics are known as non-specific amplifiers. In other words, they're just going to amplify how you're already feeling before you take them. So if you're
Mhm.
feeling very anxious and you go take a high dose of a psychedelic, it's just going to make you way more aware of how anxious you are. And sometimes that's useful, right? Because sometimes it's like the only way out is through,
Mhm.
which is why these high doses are useful because they get you to face whatever you're dealing with. But when it comes to performance, how I use it nowadays is just like I tend to have some sort of structure for my day. I am at the moment, in a very intense work period and probably will continue to be for the next 5 to 6 to 7 years as I really
Mhm.
build sort of, my legacy and profession. And so typically when I'm microdosing, it's just like a normal work day. It's usually the psilocybin lion's mane and niacin stack. It's doesn't, there's not anything specifically that I'm doing. Sometimes it'll be like a work day where I have more writing to do because it can just
Mhm.
help with the flow state of really getting into it to a writing mode. Sometimes though I'll microdose and go hiking with my business partner or with potential investors or with people we might collaborate with, and that's just a way to like, microdosing can also just help with taking a step back, having perspective on things, looking at things from a wider angle, talking about some of the high level creative brainstorming elements. So it really just depends on what you want to do with it. Another thing that I will often do is I will microdose before I do any public speaking, because
Mhm.
microdosing can help with articulation. And when it helps with articulation, I can communicate more clearly and effectively the message that I want to share with everyone. So that's what's so great about it. It can be used for various purposes, but the set and setting is important in terms of the intention that you're putting into it. And so it's really important, I think, anytime someone is microdosing, just to take a few minutes to journal beforehand and just clarify, like, why am I doing this? What's my intention for the day? Where am I going with this? And that just helps with just like visualization is a really effective way to like do things. Microdosing with visualization is an even more effective way to set that intention.
Mhm. You work with a number of high performers in doing these types of activities. And not disclosing anybody's name, obviously, but I would love to hear about some of the successes you've seen with them. But also, what are you tracking along the way in terms of like to just ensure that the benefits to the physiology are actually there? Is it all heart rate variability, or are there other things as well?
So in terms of, some of the clients that I've worked with, it has been, there's been some that have been exclusively microdosing, a few, but what they tend to be more of is those who go through a high dose experience and then need help with the integration process afterwards and want to utilize microdosing as part of their integration protocol to continue to step into their new sense of self, if you will. So when that occurs, we're both looking at quantitative and qualitative things. So,
Hmm.
with any coaching process, it's where are you now?
Yep.
Where do you want to go? What's the gap in between? And how can I, as a coach, help you get from point A to point B? So, for some people, for a lot of people, it's just like, especially for leaders, it's how can I show up more consistently and more often as my best self? And
Hmm.
how I define that is how can I show up more often in a parasympathetic state, rested and regulated, so I can respond to chaos and adversity that is so prevalent from a leadership position. So, when we're looking at what different measurements that we're taking as a result of that, one is definitely going to be sleep quality, right?
Hmm.
Which is where the aura ring comes into place because the number one key to being in a rested and regulated state is, deep sleep and probably REM sleep as well to help with kind of creativity and memory and whatnot. So heart rate is always, or not heart rate, but heart rate variability is a part of that. But I think it's more expansive than that, and just looking at general sleep quality is always the number one thing. Typically with high performing executives, there's an element to, they don't sleep well. You know, there's a sense of burnout. There's a sense of too much going on. There's not being able to really down regulate. There's not being able to really drop into a parasympathetic state. So that always has to be sort of the key North Star for anyone that I'm working with, is how can psychedelics help us stay in a regulated state more often. And then you have other things as well. You know, there's blood tests that we can do and biomarkers that we can look at that look at inflammation and, you know, how inflammation is going on. I think that's another key indicator is inflammation. High inflammation is a sign of not being so healthy. Low inflammation is usually a sign of being in a rested and regulated state more often. Exercise is another one. You know, making sure that there's consistent exercise going on is going to be key, and how you know, microdosing can help with just general motivation and building new habits. Because that's a big thing with psychedelics, is because it interrupts the default mode network and makes it easier for the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. That's a key, you know, it's opening this window of neuroplasticity, which makes it much easier to integrate new ways of being. And that's what's so great about microdosing after a high dose, is when we have this high dose ceremony, we really oftentimes start to feel into what it means to be at our best. And then when we get back into everyday life, there's work and there's family and there's relationships and there's distraction and there's triggers and there's things that draw us back into who we were before. And a key component with microdosing is let's keep that window of neuroplasticity open longer, so you continue to integrate new habits that support that new sense of self that you want to embody as a leader and a high performer. And so typically that means meditating more often, having a breathwork practice, maybe doing yoga, going to the gym consistently, eating healthier, potentially a ketogenic diet or a paleo diet. You know, there are all these things. And then when I'm working with a client, it's just like, what's going to be most useful and most effective for you with where you're currently at and what your skill set is.
So we've mentioned you mentioned integration. I want to you did a good job of explaining that. Now, some of the larger doses and experiences that people go through, I realize this kind of depends on which psychedelic you choose, but when you're guiding a high performer through this, and we can choose whichever psychedelic you'd like, the higher doses, what types of experiences do people typically go through?
With higher doses?
Yeah.
The full range of human experience. from
yeah, I should speak from my own experience. It is pretty wide ranging.
From like the most harrowing of experiences, where you experience the world suffering and the immensity and totality of that, to the most blissful, joyful, incredible, you know, experience of being one with everything, you know, and being one with creation and being one with the universe, and, you know, like just full bliss, full love. And then the specific experiences kind of go in between that. And there are people who you will experience, you know, like I recently did 3 grams of mushrooms, and I experienced the totality of that as well. I experienced the immense suffering that humanity is going through and everything that's going on right now with the coronavirus and, you know, the climate crisis and all that, and just felt that and how like intense it is and how real it is. And I also felt how grateful I was for like just being here and being alive and existing and getting to like play and talk and be in relationships and do all these beautiful things with life. And then the emotions that come with that, the anger, the sadness, the joy, the suffering, the bliss, the awe, the reverence, the whatever else it is, it's really psychedelics just allow you to experience the totality of the human condition within a safe container. And that's the key to this, right? You can't fully experience that range unless you feel safe, unless you feel like you can totally release, let go, be vulnerable, you know, and just like submit and surrender. And I feel like that's a huge part of having a successful, quote unquote, successful psychedelic experience, is you just have to surrender to whatever emotions are coming up.
So some of the personal things that have come up, I can share from my own experiences, like looking at external validation and the need for that growing up and dealing with it within a psychedelic experience. That was profound in some ways, but I mean, you've seen a lot more different types of people. what are the wide range of issues that people have been able to deal with effectively and maybe very quickly through psychedelics?
So some of the things that we already spoke about, right? Like
Mhm.
we could map them to clinical conditions like
Mhm.
PTSD or addiction or depression or anxiety, like super, super useful for that. But I think there's obviously something underneath that. And
Yeah.
underneath that is a lot of people go through what are called adverse childhood experiences,
Yep.
ACEs. And adverse childhood experiences, there's a great book called Your Body Keeps the Score, or The
Yeah.
Body Keeps the Score, which goes into by a guy named Bessel van der Kolk, that goes deep into this about how adverse childhood experiences then impact and affect our growth as adolescents and early adults. And
Hmm.
so a lot of the work that happens with psychedelics is healing from those early adverse childhood experiences. And we pretty much, I mean, there are people who go through significant ones, which are traumatic, very traumatic, which is what leads to PTSD, depression, anxiety, alcoholism, addiction are usually the case. And then, for someone like me, I had, to be honest, I was very fortunate to have a very good childhood. Up until the age of 12, everything was love and great. And I had great parents, great sisters, great upbringing, everything I needed, food, all the good things. But I still experienced my own trauma. Was when I was 10 or 11, I was basically rejected by my entire peer group for
Yeah.
being who I was. And so basically my process of
Wow.
psychedelics and overcoming that was like being able to love myself again for who I was and healing from that core wound. Because we all have these core wounds, right? And
Hmm.
so a lot of what psychedelics do is they just help us to forgive ourselves and kind of have that sense of in, incompassion, whatever, a lot of self-love
Hmm.
and the love. I know this is sort of, we're getting maybe slightly into woo woo, but I would say the compassion for oneself and the love for oneself is the key component of all of this. And
Hmm.
understanding that regardless of how odd we might be, how weird we might be, the things that we don't like about ourselves, loving every part of who we are, both the beautiful parts and all the broken parts, that's where like the healing comes in, is
Hmm.
being comfortable with loving every part of who we
So, and you've got some experience with this, right? And you've gone through a few journeys, I imagine, that have brought you to this point. Is there a running average of, let's say, how many journeys it takes before somebody starts experiencing a healing process, or is it to each their own? As in, it could be one, it could be five, etc.
are. If the individual is working with the correct healer,
Yeah,
if they're in the ideal set and setting and container, it should be the first experience every
yeah,
time. If it's not the first experience every time, then something wasn't done right.
hmm,
Like either it wasn't the correct substance that was used,
hmm,
it wasn't the correct level of substance that was used, it wasn't the right healer to be doing it with. The set and setting or the container wasn't tight enough and safe enough for the person to be able to surrender. The preparation maybe wasn't effective enough. But if all those things line up, they're prepared adequately, the set and setting is ideal, the container is tight, it's the right substance, it's the right level of substance, then with that first experience, there should always be a healing process involved.
hmm.
Always.
Frequency for high doses. Is there such a thing as too much? Because I've met people who have gone down this path, and it almost seems like it could be an addiction if you one were to look at it from an outside perspective.
So instead of, it's less of an addiction and more of a disassociation.
Gotcha.
So when people are continually going back into the high doses of medicine, it's essentially a sign that they are attempting to disassociate from the reality around them because
Hmm.
it's too difficult to face. So the analogy that I will often use when describing like how often should we do this stuff, it's like going to the dentist, right? Every 6 months, typically, we go to the dentist, we get a deep clean, they check to make sure all our teeth is good and they wash everything out. And then we go home and every day we floss, and every day we brush our teeth, and every day we use mouthwash, whatever it is that we do. So when we look at high dose psychedelic experiences are like going to the dentist. It's like getting the deep, deep clean.
Hmm.
And then microdosing or yoga or meditation or breath work or whatever it is, that's the flossing, that's the brushing your teeth, that's the consistent practice, the maintenance modality that's really going to help you to maintain that parasympathetic state on an
Hmm.
ongoing basis. So as a leader and high performer, it's you're more creative, you're more productive, you're more in flow, it's easier to respond to difficult situations, things like that.
Breathwork, you've mentioned it a couple of times. What modality do you use or teach your clients?
So the one that I haven't specifically started working with clients with breath work. I want to start to use that, but I've been really getting used to it myself. I typically would just do a traditional Wim Hof breath
Okay.
work in the morning with a little bit of yoga. So essentially, like deep
Yeah.
belly breaths up to the head and in and out 30 or 40 times. Breathe out, breathe in, repeat, and then go into a little bit of yoga to stretch. And then that's about it.
Okay. Two things we haven't mentioned, and I know we're coming up on time here. Two things we haven't really mentioned. We've focused a lot on LSD and psilocybin, but we haven't really spoke that much about MDMA or ketamine. Um, do you mind just touching on MDMA, maybe as a microdosing substance, but I'm more interested as to what's going on the scientific side with MDMA on the larger doses.
Yeah. So when it comes to microdosing, we generally recommend that people do not do a microdosing regimen with MDMA, and
Yeah.
that's because it's an amphetamine as well,
Okay.
and so it can be slightly addictive. Whereas LSD and psilocybin are anti-addictive. You
Mhm.
cannot become addicted to them. So that's one thing to be mindful of. So when it comes to high doses of MDMA, the technical term for them is an empathogen because they really help to open the heart and
Yeah.
empathy and compassion. And so it really looks like, MDMA is good for two specific use cases. One is healing trauma, specifically acute trauma.
Mhm.
That's why it's so useful for treating PTSD, is because normally with PTSD, when war veterans, for example, come back and they try to talk about, these experiences that have happened to them as a catharsis to get it out, they can't talk about it because their amygdala tightens up so much. Their
Mhm.
fear-based response gets so tight. And what happens when you take MDMA and psilocybin, but specifically MDMA, is it loosens up the amygdala really well. So you can talk about these really traumatic experiences without becoming overwhelmed, essentially.
Mhm.
So that's one good use case for it. The other great use case for it is in relationships.
Mhm.
There's often times when we're in close relationships with people in our lives, we get sort of in the head and we get back and forth about logic and rational and I'm right and you're wrong and and what MDMA does is it just helps us to realize that's just a story we're telling ourselves. We're here, we're connected, our hearts are open. I've done MDMA with my business partner. It's been incredibly useful. I think
Mhm.
MDMA in, for example, executive teams or leadership retreats or whatever else will be so, so useful for facilitating better communication, especially
Mhm.
when things get stuck, with people. It's also great for romantic relationships and personal relationships. Just sometimes after we've been dating or married someone for a long period of time, things can get stale, or there's separation and distance that starts to occur. And doing MDMA on a I don't know, maybe every 6 months to a year as like a relational ritual, I think is very useful just to like reconnect and rebond about what matters most, which is the relationship.
Mhm. Yeah, MDMA for me, and I wouldn't say it was necessarily a PTSD incident, but MDMA for me was profound. Again, set and setting, I had a therapist with me, and it was just like first time, boom, opening up so much stuff, but extremely, extremely effective. Um, let's talk about ketamine because ketamine right now, you can go and get it in depression clinics. How do we look at this in terms of I guess microdosing, but also larger doses.
So again, ketamine, it could be a potential good replacement for traditional pharmaceuticals from a microdosing perspective,
Yeah.
but it also is addictive. So I think microdosing ketamine and MDMA, be very cautious. I think it's always better to microdose psilocybin as a starting point. Ketamine, again, as a methodology for treating depression, it's legal. So there are dozens and probably hundreds of ketamine clinics that are open in the United States and Canada, and there are dozens and hundreds more that will be open very soon. Ketamine is technically a dissociative, It has an amazing process of just cutting out the ego completely. And so you kind of exist in this weird in-between hyperspace area. It lasts only 45 minutes to an hour usually, so it's much quicker than typical psychedelics. And the best use of ketamine is with Bodywork, where with ketamine, and actually I just had this about a week ago, and I did a 2-hour Bodywork session with ketamine. And
Sorry, like you got the reaction with me because I was like, somebody else has told me this recently, and I'm trying to figure out who it was.
Dave Burns?
It may have been actually, yeah.
Because Dave was the one who hooked it up for me.
Oh, fair enough. If Dave is listening to this, I'm gonna call you and make you hook it up.
Yeah. And what happens is, like, again, we store so much trauma in our somatic body, and it's not conscious, it's subconscious and unconscious. And so if working with a great body worker who really understands all, like, where we hold this stuff, then ketamine just allows the ego to get out of the way, all the resistance get out of the way, so you can just be like an open canvas. And then it's really easy to start to dig in from a body work perspective to, like, loosen up all these aspects of who we are. And that, it was basically like doing a 2-hour bodywork session was like a week of plant medicine.
Wow.
It was that effective in terms of the shift that happened after that.
Shit, that's amazing.
And so I think that's another, like, when you know, the people who are listening to this podcast, when we look at most effective modalities for catalyzing shifts and change in a short period of time, ketamine with bodywork is one. MDMA with a certified therapist is another. One thing we haven't talked about yet is ayahuasca, but that's a whole nother conversation, which we may
have to do that as a part 2, because
I think that's going to be in part 2. That'll be in part 2. And then I think microdosing, you know, on an ongoing basis as largely an anti-inflammatory supplement is also really, really useful. So I think that's when I'm looking at, like, these different combinations. And that's what's so great about psychedelics is it's not just about the psychedelic. It's about what lifestyle change or what other modality, whether it's yoga or breath work or body work or meditation or whatever else, how can you combine that with ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin? Because again, these psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. So they just open up. They make it much easier for you to adapt and change. They really, really help with adaptability. And then if it's done within another container, another modality, it's like the synergistic effect that really helps with shifting things very quickly.
Amazing. Before we go into the final few questions that are more rapid fire, in terms of resources for people, aside from your own website, which we'll talk about in a little bit, what books do you recommend people delve into for this?
Jim Fadiman's The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide is usually the first one that pops up. I think it's well written, it's pragmatic, it's concise, there's some great stories, it gives the whole lens of set and setting and how to use it responsibly. There's a section on microdosing. Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind is fantastic. New York Times bestseller, top 10 book of 2018, and gives the most in-depth perspective of where psychedelics currently stand, what the research is, why it's so useful, why it's so important. And then another book is called Consciousness Medicine by Françoise Borzat. Françoise is one of the 5 guides who is working with the FDA right now to develop clinical standards and guidelines for the use of psychedelics in a clinical way. And she wrote a book which is basically now the go-to reference for how to guide psychedelic experiences. And I think it's a really good read for anyone who's looking at preparation, experience, and integration, and how it relates to the physical body, the mind, the emotional body, connection to community. You know, there are a few other elements of that as well.
Amazing. Paul, this has been a just amazing education over the past 50 minutes. And I think we need to transition, just because cognizant of time here, into some final questions. But I would love to have you back for a round 2. Perhaps when I'm in California, we can do it in person. But first question is what book has had the most impact on your life and how you live it?
Walden by Henry David Thoreau.
Oh, good. That's such a good one. Wow. That's a great one. How do you, and you may be biased here, how do you enhance your focus?
By resting.
What what excites you the most about the health world right now?
Personalized medicine and the transition from um, the patient doctor relationship to person-centered healthcare, where we can finally have all of our own agency and power back in our hands to make ideal decisions for what we need as individuals.
Love that. Love that. Where can people find out more about you, your work, the third wave, etc.?
So our website is thethirdwave.co. So thethirdwave.co. My personal website is paulaustin.co. I like these co. The retreat center that I started, which is based out of the Netherlands, and if people go there, let them know that I sent you, is synthesisretreat.com, and that's higher doses. And then I'm on Twitter and on Instagram at Paul Austin 3W. So Paul Austin 3W is where you can find me on the socials.
Amazing. The show notes for this one are going to be at decodingsuperhuman.com/thirdwave. Paul, thank you for this amazing education. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on the show, Boomer. It was a pleasure.
To all the superhumans listening out there, have an epic day.